Glenn share his knowledge with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pablo, for that warm welcome. And thanks to all of you. We were just talking about operating in a pandemic. And one of the things that's involved in doing that is getting on Zoom calls to engage in political participation or just education that normally one would have the pleasure of doing in person and establishing connections. So I'm very grateful to you for taking the time to do that. And Pablo, perhaps you could take it out of sharing your screen, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. Sorry about that.
Great. Well, it's great to see all of you up there. Just by way of background, my name is Glenn Hurowitz. As you heard, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Mighty Earth. We're a global environmental advocacy organization. I co-founded the organization with former Congressman Henry Waxman, who is a real hero of mine and one of probably the most prolific environmental, healthcare, and public interest champions in the last 50 years. And so when he retired from Congress, he and I teamed up and we founded Mighty Earth, which is just a few years ago, but we've already grown to almost 40 people working on our core staff, and then many more local partners working around the world. And we're working on some of the biggest, thorniest issues, like breaking the link between agricultural expansion and deforestation, driving action on climate change, and oceans conservation. And a huge focus of ours is protecting the indigenous communities who make forests their homes, and are also the victims, therefore, of deforestation, displacement, disease that comes along with irresponsible development. But they're also, I think it's important to emphasize, some of probably the single best guardians in most cases of the forests. And if you look at what's happening in South America, those forests that have indigenous communities living in them, protecting them, by far have the most conservation success. And so that's really informed our perspective. I did just want to say before continuing that I have had the privilege of working alongside Unitarian Universalists for my entire career, working to protect the environment and human rights. Whether it's protecting the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or acting on climate change across the United States, or working internationally, Unitarian Universalists have been so close. And even here in Washington, D.C., my sister-in-law was the head of the Greater Washington Interfaith Power and Light. And so I've worked both here nationally and in many states around the world, around the country, with Unitarian Universalists. So thank you all for your amazing and continually inspiring work, and doing something that I think is so important, which is grounding social change work in faith and social justice. So thank you for all that. Before continuing, because it's on Zoom and because listening to somebody talk on it through a computer can be a little tedious, I know from experience over the last 6 months, I wanted to share a couple of videos. And let me just exit out of this for 1 second. First show just a little video to introduce you to the work that Mighty Earth does, so you can see tangibly what it looks like on the ground and what we're trying to achieve. So hopefully this works. Please chat me if there's a challenge. Okay.
The forests of South America are wildlife paradises and vitally important for local communities. These precious lands are being systematically cleared and burned to make way for massive soybean plantations. Most of this soy will be used as animal feed for the world's meat. Mighty's team went to work to document and expose this destruction, releasing its Mystery Meat Report in February 2017. Within months, 23 of the world's largest companies signed a declaration to end deforestation in Brazil. Mighty Earth's report sparked momentum for a change in practices across the industry. Mighty Earth's campaigns are making U.S. agriculture sustainable, bringing demand for environmentally responsible palm oil to Asian markets, conserving African great ape habitat, deploying clean energy, and protecting clean water.
Sadly, we can't always look to governments to solve climate change or protect forests. We've got to go right to the root of the problem by changing what businesses are doing. That's Mighty Earth's top priority, and it is delivering unbelievable results on the ground.
All right, thank you for listening. Hope that came through. That's the big picture of the work we do, but I also wanted to ground it a little bit in my own personal story and why I became so passionate to dedicate my life to protecting rainforests and acting on the environment. It really goes back to when I was a little kid and first climate change hit the headlines when I was about 10 years old and distracted me. And I was this kid lugging around a trash can of recycled, for recycling cans and trying to think of little small actions I could take in my own life. And I remember in middle school, when the burning of the Amazon really came to international consciousness, my school organized a run for the rainforest where we were supposed to go out and raise money from friends and family to contribute to protecting acres of forest. And I was very motivated by this, even at that young age when I learned about what was happening to the Amazon. And I remember I think I raised a couple $1,000s through enthusiastic fundraising and running very, very fast to exhaustion because I was so passionate about it. But it wasn't until much later that I learned how one could act strategically to protect the environment. And it was really through the Green Corps Fellowship where I got to go out and run environmental campaigns with a lot of different environmental organizations from Greenpeace, Sierra Club, US PIRG, and others in different parts of the country, and learned how grassroots recruitment, coalition building, working with the media, lobbying could really drive extraordinary change. And even as a 22 or 23-year-old just out of college, I found myself in a position where through organizing, through mobilizing groups of people, we were able to change senators' votes on big issues like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, like energy policy. And it was really inspiring to me that I could go to North Dakota and through organizing, within 6 weeks, change policy on a federal issue. I never thought I would have that kind of responsibility or opportunity at such a young age. And that really inspired me working all across the country to pursue this. And my whole career since then has really been focused on bringing the basics of grassroots organizing to different levels, first doing it at the state level, then at the national level, and more recently at the international level. In 2006, traveled to Bolivia as part of the book I was writing about politics because I had seen this movie about Evo Morales, who had become elected as the first indigenous president of Bolivia, and thought he was this great progressive hero. Unfortunately, when I went there, I learned a lot more about him and some of his unsavory deals with fossil fuel and agribusiness interests, and overall a sort of very dark vision that he had for the country that was displacing many of the actual indigenous communities that were not from his own territory. And but it reawakened, that trip reawakened my love for and interest in the rainforest as I traveled throughout the country and was able to spend time with indigenous communities, many of whom were under threat from agribusiness. One of the things that struck me the most was actually flying from La Paz in the west to Santa Cruz in the east, which is in the agricultural heartland. And for much of the trip, you fly for about an hour over what used to be the Amazon rainforest, teeming with jaguars and sloths and alive with communities that have lived there for thousands of years. And instead of forest, all it is degraded scrubland, deforested. In fact, there's 1.6 billion acres of land across Latin America alone that was deforested and cleared for cattle ranches and animal feed. And that I found both, depressing, but also tragic, because I knew that just even from the perspective of climate change, those forests are the lungs of the earth. They breathe in carbon dioxide, they breathe out oxygen. They store more than 9 times the annual fossil fuel emissions of the globe. We cannot solve climate change unless we protect the world's forests. And so I set about initially to try to pass legislation in the United States that would make trees worth more alive than dead, and essentially provide, in the Waxman-Markey climate bill that was passed the House of Representatives in 2009, would have provided $12 to $14 billion in funding for tropical rainforest conservation around the world. Of course, this is critically important for the endangered animals that live in the forest and for the communities, but also solving deforestation represents about 1/3 of the near-term opportunity to act on climate change. And yet it only receives 1.5% of the funding that energy does. And we need to decarbonize our whole economy by shifting to wind and solar and other kinds of clean energy. And I work on that a lot, and I've spent a lot of my career working on that issue. But the issue of rainforest conservation, nature-based solutions to climate change is totally neglected. And I think that's sad, because it has, when you solve those things, it has such powerful knock-on effects for protecting endangered species, for solving a biodiversity crisis that is in fact about 10 times as severe as the climate crisis, and also has these enormous benefits to the communities who rely on our forests. And so from that experience, I really wanted to dive into this as my career. And in the wake of the failure of the Senate in 2010 to pass climate legislation and to really give value to these forests that they deserve, I did a lot of research into what other ways you could drive change for forests. And one of the things that we found was that in 2006, due to pressure around Amazon deforestation, some of the world's biggest agribusinesses had, under pressure from customers like McDonald's and others, agreed to stop buying soy animal feed and ultimately beef and other cattle products from anybody who engaged in deforestation. And the extraordinary thing about that was this was a voluntary business commitment, but it worked. And within 3 years, deforestation for soy in the Brazilian Amazon declined to near zero levels. It had been about 25% of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, and declined to 0.25%. And just to, I'm going to share my screen again to show you. So this is this is the situation right now globally, where we have about 30 million acres every year of deforestation. And this is, over time, it's like, just for soy alone, it's the combined area of France, Germany, and Belgium being completely not wiped off the planet and leaving behind these massive ecological deserts. But one of the fascinating things is that if you look at the graph below, is that it's not possible. The paradox is that because of the amount of degraded land, previously deforested land, 1.6 billion acres in Latin America alone, you can actually expand agriculture onto those lands without threatening native ecosystems. And that is what exactly what happened in Brazil. It was this amazing environmental, economic win-win, where the companies stopped buying from deforesters and instead planted on these degraded lands and were able to grow their soy and cattle production. And Brazil was able to double it at the same time that it reduced deforestation by 3/4. So this was this inspiring example, but it was confined to just the Brazilian Amazon. And meanwhile, over the border in Bolivia, in Argentina, and Paraguay, the bulldozers were continuing to operate. And this was the situation when we started to get involved. And one of the things that we found was that where given the opportunity, indigenous communities across all of South America and indeed in other places in the world were able to actually defend their lands. But when they were under assault by agribusiness interests, including many American companies like Cargill, Bunge, whose ultimate customers were brand names that we know, McDonald's, Burger King, Stop and Shop, etc., it was hard for them to get a chance. And indeed, they were under assault. And we've seen this most keenly in the last couple of years. With Bolsonaro taking over in Brazil and on a seeming crusade to undo his own country's triumph in reducing deforestation and expanding agriculture production at the same time, we gutted environmental enforcement, protection for indigenous communities, and launched cattle ranchers, soy farmers, and illegal gold miners deep into the Amazon and other ecosystems in Brazil. Unfortunately, this phenomenon is not just confined to the right-wing government of Brazil. In Bolivia, just next door, where they had a nominally very left-wing government until last year, at the same time that the Amazon was burning and received global headlines in Brazil, exactly the same thing, driven by many of the same companies like Cargill, based in Minnesota, was happening there. And Bolivia last year had its greatest environmental crisis in history. And so we've looked to see how we can drive solutions even in the face of major governance challenges. Wherever we work across the tropics, almost everywhere, we see challenges of corruption, lack of governance, and lack of capacity. And here in the United States, in Europe, in many parts of developed Asia, and in the countries themselves, there are a lot of people who care deeply about what is happening to the rainforest and to local communities, but don't know what they can do about it. And what we found is that through the kinds of campaigns that I showed in my initial video, there is an opportunity for people to really make a kind of outsized difference that it's hard to imagine. And we first hit on the success actually in our work in Southeast Asia, where we were fighting deforestation for palm oil, which is the largest driver of deforestation there and gets its way into cookies and soaps and shampoos all around the world. And through these same kinds of campaigns, focused initially on companies like Kellogg's that were in bed with some of the biggest deforesters in the world operating in Southeast Asia, we found that activists working here in the United States and elsewhere were able to exert such a powerful influence on these big agribusinesses just by showing up and holding protests outside their headquarters, by saying we're going to shift our buying behavior, by investors weighing in and saying we're not going to invest in companies that are connected to outsized environmental destruction. We were able to create a kind of perfect storm that influenced even some of the most notorious companies to change. And in Southeast Asia, learning from that initial example in Brazil, starting in 2013, we were able to persuade Asia's largest agribusiness, this previously notorious company called Wilmar International, which controlled 45% of global palm oil trade, to adopt the world's strongest forest conservation and human rights policies of any agribusiness. And it's quite extraordinary that a Singaporean agribusiness that does most of its business in China was actually the leader in global agribusiness ahead of many of its US counterparts. But they were subject to the kind of commercial pressure from around the world. One of the other things that's happened in our campaigns is that our best friend is momentum. So when we go after the largest company in an industry like Wilmar, or like Cargill, which is the largest agribusiness in the world, which is our current major target, we find that once they change, it's possible to change an entire industry. And so in the case of palm oil in Southeast Asia, we were able to convince companies representing about 90% of global palm oil to adopt similar policies and act against deforestation in their supply chain. There have been a lot of challenges on the way after they made their commitments, because the challenge is governments are not doing their job. In some cases, like in Brazil and Bolivia, because of a kind of ideological commitment to destruction. But more broadly, there's just huge capacity and corruption challenges in many of these societies. And what we found is that these companies are well positioned to do so, but it can be challenging. And what we've done is set up monitoring of more than 30 million hectares of forest all across Southeast Asia and South America to monitor deforestation and file alerts with these companies. And so initially we were finding that some of the companies that had made these big commitments were continuing to buy from suppliers who would, notwithstanding them, destroy tens of thousands of acres. We would send people out into the forest and use our satellites to capture pictures of what was going on, file grievances with their ultimate consumers, the big brands that, Unilever and Mars and others. And the extraordinary thing is when we did that, they acted, and often within 48 hours. And so we were able to establish systems in Southeast Asia that reduced deforestation for palm oil from 1 million acres a year when we started to now fewer than 250,000 in each of the last 3 years. This is a gigaton scale climate success story. And we've been able to spread it more recently to cocoa, which is a large driver of deforestation in West Africa, as well as rubber, and where they've set up similar mechanisms. And we're really pleased last year, after just a couple of years, to see major reductions in deforestation in West Africa to complement what was happening in Southeast Asia. And so we hope to replicate those elsewhere. The big challenge that we faced is that notwithstanding this dramatic success that's little known, but is really quite important, and one of the great good news stories of climate change is that it has not happened in the meat industry. The same companies that have made these strong commitments for cocoa, palm oil, rubber, and paper have refused to do so when it comes to meat. And meat is the largest driver of deforestation in the world. There's 1 million square kilometers of land dedicated just to grow soy animal feed. And there's even much larger areas dedicated to cattle ranching. More than 40% of the United States itself is dedicated to cattle ranching, and large swaths of South America in particular. And so even where we're seeing progress through these private sector strategies in Africa and Southeast Asia, in South America, and even when it comes to pollution in the North American agriculture industry, it's a much harder situation. And this is the challenge that we've been addressing ourselves to. Initially, we had very little funding to do this, and we've been the kind of lead advocacy organization working around the world on this issue. But we only had a few $100,000 a year initially, and we've in the last year been able to raise more resources, and so we're now finally scaling up this campaign across the United States and in Europe and elsewhere. And just to get this to work, this is our theory of change, and I've taken a Latin American example here, where we create, through all these activities, we try to create a perfect storm that can really mobilize commitment. This is a big deal. Emissions from deforestation were over 800 million tons per year. Last year, Amazon deforestation in Brazil alone was the highest it's been in 13 years. So things, despite the examples of success we've seen in Southeast Asia and Africa, and rubber and cocoa and palm oil and paper, things have been going in the wrong direction. And this was the success story, where you break the link between environmental destruction and economic growth. And yet what we're seeing are these vast examples of deforestation. We've done multiple investigations on the ground across 3,000 kilometers of the agricultural frontier in Bolivia, Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. And I think it's kind of hard to wrap your head around exactly what this looks like. These are really vast areas that are cleared and deforested. And I just wanted to show a video from one of our partners. It's a short video to give kind of a sense of this. And let me find it right here. I think I need to share.
Quando alguém me pergunta o que aconteceu na Amazônia, me dá uma angústia.
These fires, they're not starting naturally. They're done on purpose to destroy the forests and shut back the indigenous territories.
A gente precisa trabalhar, sobreviver, né? E sem serviço não dá.
Morreu já. Não tem jeito no Brasil, tá falando. É que tudo igual não morar aqui, ué. Não morar aqui, ó. E nós, você fala que respeitar, nós matamos branco. Quando não respeitar entrar lá, morreu à toa, eu não. É que problema. Dinheiro. O apoio virado área boa. O que levar?
Tudo em cima do que só serve para alimentar a cobiça de quem já é muito rico. E usa pequenos para invadir, para desmatar, para queimar, para ameaçar de morte.
Eu acharia que tinha que ser mais compartilhada, né? Porque tem muita gente que necessita de uma terra, né? Para fazer plantação.
Indigenous people is actually helping us and they're protecting the forest so that we can survive on this planet. What happens here is not just about Brazil or a few other countries. What happens here impacts the whole world.
Ninguém larga a mão de ninguém, fica de luta.
It's a matter of protecting the land for indigenous communities, protecting what we have on the planet right now.
Não, não posso.
Enquanto eu tiver vida, eu vou lutar. Eu não vou desistir nunca.
This filmmaker, Chelsea Green, is really quite extraordinary, and she's very nicely working with us and sharing the images and for our campaigns. And so we're grateful for that, and it really gives, I think, a sense of what's at stake. And I think what's so frustrating to me when I see images like that, and when I've experienced that on the ground, is that it's so avoidable and unnecessary. And our own work to change what these companies do have shown such examples of success, even in the Brazilian Amazon with soy and to a lesser extent cattle, and yet they won't stop the bulldozers elsewhere because of inertia, because of corruption, because of greed, and for ideological reasons. And so that's why we are so focused on ramping up this campaign to transform the meat industry. Just there was a question in the chat to show the theory of change again, and I'll share that diagram, but maybe just for a second, I'll go forward a little bit further to show some more detail. I assume it's appearing as full screen right now for you.
Now it is. We're seeing Latin America's world's biggest dry commodity.
Great. And so, so this is, this is a lot of what we're doing. And I wrote an article recently, Yale E360, about this theory of change and how we're trying to take it from the success from Southeast Asia and from parts of Brazil to spread it across the whole continent and to the whole meat industry. But let me go forward and just show exactly what that looks like. So in terms of our plan for changing this, and this is something that we're right in the middle of right now. We've made similar maps to change other industries like cocoa and rubber and palm oil, and it's worked. And it's been cool to see like something go from a PowerPoint slide to the reality of an industry. But in the meat industry, that has not happened yet. And so what we are doing is we're trying to mobilize activists all over the world, as well as do high-level engagement with investors, consumers, to put pressure on some of these big brands. If you go to mightyearth.org, I'd encourage you to take action, and you can send a message to companies like Costco here in the US that are sourcing from some of the worst deforesters, companies like Cargill and JBS. And just to share a little bit of an anecdote, last year we put together a report about Cargill, which is the world's largest agribusiness and is not only driving the destruction of the rainforests and indigenous communities of South America, but also has been a leading driver of the destruction of the national parks of West Africa for cocoa, where they have employed through their supply chains people making less than $1 a day, including many children. There's a great Washington Post expose about that that we worked on last year as well. And then in the United States, they produce more greenhouse gas emissions per bushel of corn than any other company, and are notorious for polluting the water in the Midwest, Gulf of Mexico, Chesapeake Bay, for meat. And also have been laggards on action on palm oil. But we put together this big report called Worst Company in the World. Let me see if I have I don't have an image of it right here, but we shared it with the CEO, with Cargill, as we usually do. We give the companies that we focus on a chance to review and preview and respond to our materials, tell us if we got anything wrong before we publish it. And we heard that they wouldn't do anything, but 4 days before we were due to publish, the CEO of Cargill called me and asked me to hold off, give him 2 weeks to consider what we were asking for these big changes. And so we got on the phone, we said, okay, we'll give you 2 weeks, got on the phone again after 2 weeks. And he said, yes, that they would make changes. They would stop buying from suppliers that deforested. They would change their US agricultural operations. They would transform cocoa and palm oil. And unlike literally dozens of other companies that we've helped change, unfortunately, his own staff defied him. And there was a war inside the company between those who have to sell their products to big brands and understand that people increasingly want to know where their food is coming from and that it's produced in a manner consistent with their values, and those who are used to doing business the old way. And even though they admit you can expand onto degraded lands, they don't want to interfere with their contracts or go up against the Brazilian government or others. And so we had this very frustrating experience over 4 months where this company just failed to deliver utterly on its pledge. And it was very disappointing. And I feel that we got very close to driving the kind of transformation in the meat industry that we've seen in these other industries. But they weren't following through. And so we released this report. There was a big article in the New York Times, as well as lots of media around the world about it. And that has helped inspire activists to turn out at, both in the forest nations that we're working to protect, but also here in the United States to take action at companies like Costco and Tyson, and Stop and Shop, and that are the ultimate consumers of this meat. And we're starting to see some change, although too often it's still these consumer companies calling politely for action instead of actually cutting off their contracts. And when it comes to companies like Cargill or other big deforesters like JBS, they really only respond when there's commercial consequences. Indeed, I had a fancy lunch last year with the #2 executive at Cargill, just as we were about to launch the campaign, and she was saying, we're not going to do what you're asking us to in the final analysis. And she said, look, we're under a lot of political pressure in Brazil, and we're making a lot of money. And all of these companies whose brands are listed here, they talk about how much they want to save the rainforest, and they gnash their teeth and they say they're very upset, and they write us letters, but they don't actually cut off business with us. And, in a certain level, she's right. Like, until there's real I wish they would do it because it's right, because it's in their long-term or even, relatively short-term economic interests. But often these big companies need a wake-up call, and their customers and their investors are not providing that sufficiently. And so we're trying to bring maximum pressure and ignite the kind of movement that has led to success in so many areas. And so I think I'll close there and say, I guess, this is particularly acute in the time of coronavirus, as inconvenient it is for all of us. And I think many of us know people who have been directly affected by this virus. For the indigenous communities of the Amazon, it's been even more acute. And they die at about double the rate of white people in South America. And in many cases, their communities don't have that many people left. And these are the last defenders of the forest. And so this is a real crisis. This is not just deforestation continuing at its normal levels. And as the burning happens, it sends haze into the environment that has killed hundreds of thousands of people. And it's worse when you have a respiratory disease like COVID that's so widespread, making their lungs more vulnerable to it. And so we've oriented part of our work not only around protecting this endangered wildlife and these communities, but also as a response to and a solution for pandemics. Because deforestation is actually the #1 cause of pandemics historically. It's the source of the AIDS epidemic. Ebola came from deforestation, bringing humans into contact with wildlife. And so we want to prevent that in the future. We think that not only protecting forests, transforming agriculture is a critical solution to climate change and biodiversity and human rights, but also a solution to our current crisis. And so I hope you will all go to mightyearth.org and take action, but also join us and support us. Thank you guys so much for listening. I'm very happy to take any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Glenn. We deeply appreciate your time with us. And I know from the chat that there's lots of interest in your slide on your theory of change. And as good UUs, I'm sure that folks want to look at it, scrutinize it, and figure out how they can apply that theory of change to their own circumstance and their own social justice passions. Just to answer a question that's come up a couple of times in the chat, yes, we have been recording, we are recording, and we will distribute the video in a day or so after we've edited it a little bit. So look for that in a day or so. So for right now, I'm gonna kick it off with one question, and then I'm gonna ask folks to, again, go to the chat, the participant list, go to the bottom of the participant list and raise your electronic hand so that we can see you and I can call on you and your name appears in the participant list so I can manage that. We'll take about 10, 15, 20 minutes of questions and then we'll give Glenn the last comment. Before I do that, I want to just quickly show Glenn raised the notion of what we can do. I want to point out to you that with UUSJ this month, you can do some advocacy yourself. We have the opportunity to write letters to the Senate on increasing funding within the EPA for impacted communities. You can go to our main page here. You can click on right here, right now, handout. It'll take you to this and it'll give you some guidance on how to write a letter that UUSJ will then deliver for you. Or you can follow the other link that says online, which is also available here. And it'll take you to a direct online platform where you can treat this like your own typewritten letter and send it, and it will go to your 2 senators. So bear that in mind. My first question for you, Glenn, since you raised the issue of ecological devastation and the impact on both communities and animals, and communities of animals, is could you just speak for a very brief moment on what's Mighty Earth's assessment of the border wall and the construction of the border wall, and what's that doing to both indigenous communities and poor impacted folks, communities along the southwest border or southern border of the United States, as well as the animal communities?
Sure. Great question. So I should say Mighty Earth is not working on that issue, but we're working on a lot, but that's one thing we haven't done. I actually personally have worked on that and spent several days on a reporting trip as a journalist some time ago on the border communities in Texas when this first was being proposed and the wall was starting to be built. And the answer is it has, not only culturally divided a region that, where people have families on both sides of the border, but also had really terrible effects on wildlife. And particularly there's some very rare creatures like jaguars and ocelots that used to migrate across the border, Sonoran pronghorn antelope, and now they're divided. And especially, I have to say, like, Bush started the border, well, really Clinton started the border wall with just a few miles, but then Bush, under pressure, although he initially opposed it, changed his mind and built several hundred miles. Unfortunately, Barack Obama continued to build a lot of the wall, and Trump, of course, has only accelerated that trend. And so, when you divide wildlife from each other, especially when you only have small populations, it has a really negative impact. And I think regardless of what you feel about immigration, like the border wall does nothing to stop immigration. I don't think Trump realizes the fact that people from Mexico know how to use ladders or dig tunnels, and it has little, that's not even how most people come into the United States. And so it's just a kind of pointless political gesture that has even limited impact on the issue it's supposed to address, which itself is of questionable justice.
I'm speaking on mute. I apologize for that. Thank you so much. So I'd like to open it up for questions. The first one that I see is from David Shilton of Arlington.
Thank you, Glenn, for your work, which is great. You mentioned the Waxman-Markey bill that died in 2010, and it had, I guess, significant funding for preserving forests, the tropical forests. There's a lot of legislative proposals that have been introduced recently with the thought that, if things change in January, that they may go through. But I haven't heard anything about that provision being adopted in any of those. Do you know if there are any, if there's any current legislative proposals that do that same thing?
So what's really interesting is that in the Trump-Biden debate, which was overall a horrible experience and a debacle for our country, Joe Biden expressed his support for mobilizing $20 billion worth of rainforest funding. So there's no particular pieces of legislation on that right now, although it is something that we and others believe is a critical part of the U.S. contribution to action on climate. And so if Congress has the opportunity next year to actually pass comprehensive climate legislation or act individually on this issue, I'm hopeful that could be part of it. There is another policy initiative that's complementary and supportive, and that is introduced or will be introduced by Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii, as well as hopefully a Republican co-sponsor probably after the election. And that would limit imports of commodities or ban imports of commodities linked to illegal deforestation. And Europe and the UK are also considering similar legislation right now. So we're hoping to make a global trend. I worked on something called the Lacey Act that bars import of illegally logged timber and other products. And that is considered to have actually, and that's in place already. And so we're just trying to expand that to other commodities like meat, like palm oil. And so, we hope that under new administration, we might be able to get the support for that. One final policy issue in the United States I'd mention is one of the craziest things that we do is burn large amounts of corn and soybeans and even a little bit of palm oil in people's gas tanks because of for biofuels. And biofuels are even more damaging to the environment and to the climate than dirty old oil. And I think it's just morally obscene to burn so much food when there are hungry people in the world. And so that's another thing that we've tried to change. And one of the cool things is we've done a lot of grassroots organizing in Iowa and other parts of the Midwest. And we did it during the presidential campaign, primary campaign. And what we found was that people are coming out of the woodwork in Iowa to oppose biofuel mandates and big ag more broadly, which I think was counter to conventional wisdom and even countered a little bit to what we expected, because they drink the water and they breathe the air and they smell the smells, and they're very upset at what a lot of these big companies have done economically and environmentally. And so I think there's a huge misperception in the corridors of power, fueled in part by campaign donations and lobbying. But this is one of the biggest, burning that much food creates extra pressure on the world's forests. And so that's a key policy the US can pursue. Biden has not been great on that issue, but we're hoping, he will take climate seriously. And part of that involves shifting to more electrification instead of liquid fuels.
Thanks so much. Our next question is from Lee McNair.
Yes. Advocacy is very important, of course, especially for long-term change. But there's also the effort to hit these companies in their purse or their pocketbook that can really have an impact and get their attention. Is there a way to get the brands or the products boycotted?
Well, I like the way you think, Lee, and that's really what our experience has been, is that it's ultimately commercial pressure on the brands that makes a difference. So a couple of companies that we're focused on that are complicit in this. One is Costco, which is one of the biggest purchasers of meat from Cargill, and also JBS, which is the largest cattle company in Brazil and also a big meat company in the United States. So we're asking members of Costco to take action on our website or Costco, their own Costco membership website, to send a message directly to Costco. And one of the cool things about Costco, because they're membership driven, their senior executives actually respond to every letter that they get from a member, and we know they take it seriously, and that actually contributed to us getting a meeting with their CEO to discuss these issues. They haven't acted yet, but it's a way to bring pressure. And then the other one is Stop and Shop and Giant, which both have are owned by the same conglomerate called Ahold Delhaize, and for those of you in the Washington D.C. area, they're present here, and they are actually owned by this big Dutch conglomerate, which has professed to take these issues very seriously. And then, to our amazement, despite all of those professions, they actually launched a joint venture meat plant with Cargill itself, which is, in our view, the worst of these companies. And so we're calling on consumers to take action, communicate with go into a store, talk to the manager about this, write an email through our website, go on social media, and act. And yeah, I mean, this is what's changed attitudes in the past, is if we can get enough people to take action. I think we're starting to get a critical mass, but I don't think we're quite there on this issue yet. So that's really welcome.
Next question is from, I guess the person lowered their hand. Their question must have been answered. So I'll give folks a second or two to think of another question. In the interim, I'll ask you, Glenn, you spoke about your personal experience of becoming, I guess, aware of environmental issues as a young person, as a grade schooler, and then you referenced comments by others that, you know, the change needs to be focused on youth. Unitarian Universalists are very concerned with the intergenerational dimension of social justice work. And so I wonder if you have any reflections on your, you know, from your many years of campaign experience on how you include youth in these kinds of campaigns so that they're getting exposed to the type of values that have knock-on effects in an intergenerational manner further down the line.
Well, let me first say I reject the idea that it's only youth, because you know, this is a crisis that's affecting us now, and so I think, you know, I don't want to pass the buck to younger people. We all have a responsibility to act regardless of our age, and you know, indeed, I think I was just talking with a friend of mine who's doing a lot of political campaigning right now about how retired people are on the progressive side of kind of ignored activist political constituency, even though they are often the activist powerhouses of progressive action. And so, you know, we work with people of all ages, and that's essential, and that's equally great, frankly. But regarding young people, we do a lot of outreach. We do a lot of organizing on campuses. You know, for us, particularly college campuses, there are organizations that are more dedicated to working, you know, with high schoolers and even younger. You know, and I think appropriately, it's often more educational. And while we do a lot of education, we're also activism oriented. One interesting thing is that we found very powerful is these companies really care a lot about what their employees think and what their potential employees think. And I think one of the generational shifts that's happened is much more than it used to be. You know, people go to work wanting to bring their conscience to work, even if they're working in a big corporation that we might think of as notorious. They want to feel like that company is doing good, and they kind of buy into a lot of the marketing. And so when they learn that Kellogg is in bed with the worst palm oil deforester in the world, when, you know, they learn that Cargill, which spews greenwashing in every airport in the country, is actually the leading driver of deforestation, and has this kind of army of child laborers in its supply chain, you know, it's jarring for them, and they get upset and they want to take action. And companies that have that issue can lose out in the competition for talented employees. And so this has actually been one of the engines of our success, is concern of employees and potential employees. And we go into the neighborhoods of executives and other workers and talk to them about these issues, and it's been very powerful.
I'd like to, the next question is from Bob Denniston, UUSJ's board chair. Thanks, Bob, for joining us.
Glenn, thanks. Very impressive work. What's your view of the new alternatives to meat products, such as Beyond Meat and a few others? Health effects aside, but what's the impact on the environment? Is there a way you think to help reduce public demand for traditional meat products by using these kind of products that may have or may not have health benefits, but may have more of an environmental impact?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think reducing or eliminating meat consumption is one of the best individual actions we can take for the environment. You know, chicken is about triple the environmental impact of a plant-based diet, pork 5 or 6 times, and beef 16 times. So it's really makes a big difference for the environment. I think overall plant-based diets are healthier. You're right that there's, I'd say, mixed reviews of the comparative health impacts of, you know, stuff like the Beyond Burger, Impossible Burger, although they are pretty delicious. And I don't know how many people are eating hamburgers as health foods anyway. So if you want you know, if you want to indulge in a hamburger or a hot dog, you can have a pretty delicious option. I don't know if it's going to be better for your health or not, but it will be lighter on the planet. And so I think that's a good option. And then I would just say, I've been a vegetarian for a really long time, and my wife is an amazing plant-based cook. And so we have for a long time eaten seitan, which is wheat gluten. And that I think is pretty healthy and delicious, and actually it tastes a lot like meat. So, and there's a lot of other delicious options. I would say for anybody, anybody thinking about shifting to plant-based diet, the first few months are hard, but once you get over it, you don't want to eat meat anymore.
So I want to ask again if there's any other questions. If not, then I'm going to ask Glenn the ubiquitous, or not the ubiquitous, but the all-important sort of social justice question. What do you think we should be thinking about acting upon for the 117th Congress? Obviously, there's going to be, the chairs will change. We don't know the exact configuration, but from the perspective of your work, what do you think we should have an eye on? Who are the people who might be movable on some of these issues that we should be paying attention to?
So, Green New Deal is comprehensive action, and you can put a lot of things under that, whether it's large scale investment in clean energy, clean transportation, and nature-based solutions to climate change, like forest restoration, agricultural action, both in the United States and internationally. And so, my aspiration is that passes. There's elements of that are going to be challenging. We're going to require a lot of hard work in the Senate in particular to get that over the finish line. And so we're also looking at, there's a lot of individual strategies. How can you accelerate electrification of the economy, which would, in addition to just reducing the burning of oil, also reduce the burning of biofuels, which are so destructive to the climate and to water and to wildlife. We should have the kind of civilian conservation corps that can restore ecosystems across the world. We should tear down big dams. All of these things can create lots and lots of jobs. Whether it's installing clean energy or putting people to work in ecological restoration. And that's really needed now when there's such high levels of unemployment. So I think, we've missed a bit of an opportunity with all the stimulus money that's been spent. Very little of it has been spent on green strategies to fundamentally reorient our economy. So I think we may have to be, I hope we can pass one big broad piece of legislation, and I hope they do away with the filibuster to make that possible. But we're also looking at more granular things from a policy perspective. And that's, it's going to come down to writing letters to congressmen, senators, showing up at their offices, demanding action, and being really savvy.
Thanks again, Glenn, for making yourself available to UUSJ and UUs in general.
Sure, and I can just briefly say I saw a couple of questions in the chat. I'll just, Jack Leibowitz mentioned pension funds. We do a lot of work with pension funds, and I would talk to your pension fund about weighing in with these companies. They can be a really important constituency. We work very closely with them. And then what gives me hope is actually, I am stunned often by our success in taking on these big companies, and how, a small band of people, our activists, our volunteers, have been able to transform some of the world's biggest agribusinesses. We're not all the way there yet, but there's a lot of forest standing, animals that are alive, indigenous communities that have their homes because of people taking this kind of action. And so we're just trying to scale it up now, and that really gives me hope. And please get involved. Go to mightyearth.org and take action there.
And we will circulate a link if Glenn gives it to us. So thanks. Well, again, thank you for joining us this evening. We appreciate your participation. As always, we have our October right here, right now, which I showed you, focused on the EPA and funding work in impacted communities. But UUSJ also acts for the health of our democracy, economic justice, and in immigration justice. So if you feel called to get engaged on those issues as well, please let me know, and we will plug you into those groups. Thanks so much for your participation this evening, and let's give a silent but real hand to Glenn for all the great work. Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care, folks.